Right, welcome back to the second part of our C is for Creative Writing podcast. And welcome again to Yvonne, Oz, Lucy and Amina, who are here to discuss creative writing. And then we're also going to go on to discuss Simon Armitage's coronation poem in a minute as an example of creative writing in a particular context. But first of all, I just wanted to continue our discussion about what creative writing is and what it means to you, how you experience it, by thinking about creative writing as something you do in a university context, something that you do, C is for classroom, if you like, or we do sometimes tend to use that term, something you do in a group, something you do with perhaps a tutor or in a workshop situation. What's that like, either as the tutor or as the person who's participating in it? I'll be just interested to hear your thoughts on that. Do you want to go first, Lucy? Just as you've done a creative writing degree, so you've been in that situation of being in the room where the timetable says you're going to do creative writing between X and Y. How does that go?
Well, I think because starting from undergraduate and working my way through the master's and now doing the PhD, each stage of my sort of academic journey has been entirely different. It's so different going from having a class scheduled at 9 o'clock in the morning and you're going to be learning about myths and legends, and then at 2 o'clock you'll do speeches that change the world. You know, it's you cover such a vast amount of, you know, content, and you're always learning, and it's the most fulfilling feeling that, in my experience anyway, of my entire academic life here at Leeds Trinity. And then your masters, you know, you're sort of left not so much on your own. You do a bit of learning and a bit of content, and then you can run with that and do, you know, however you please and write whatever you want from it. And then at PhD, it's entirely different altogether. You're a lone ranger, and, you know, I'm very lucky to have Oz and Amina as my supervisors, you know, being able to support me through that. But it's all about the learning, really. And, you know, I've been able to experience and read and write and listen to and enjoy so much, and also fall in love with, you know, my entire journey here. And it's something that I'll never regret staying here for the 5 years, and it'll be 7 or 8 years by the time you all get rid of me. So, yeah.
Thank you. I wonder what the sort of experience of when you're in a workshop. I mean, like a typical thing you would have to do is read something. What's that like?
I think it depends really what you're covering. Really, it's always really interesting to read something beforehand, or even reading something for the first time in that workshop and being able to discuss it with people who either haven't a clue, you know, what the context is, or they're already really interested in it. And, you know, you've got, you know, tutors or lecturers like, you know, you all here, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts, and for you to also be really keen to hear our thoughts as well. And it's that conversation that is just so, you know, enigmatic, and that's just brilliant to have, really.
Thanks. Can I ask you then, Oz? You've probably been the tutor more often than you've been the student.
Yeah, it's I have been. Although whenever the opportunity arises, I do like to go to creative writing workshop or something, because it's interesting, the word that Lucy used towards the end of their conversation, and I think we get a sense of this sort of post-romantic idea of the writer sat in their little room or wandering lonely as a cloud or whatever. And there is something about creativity, even on that very individual level, that comes out of conversation. You can't write, obviously, without reading to start with. And I think as a guiding principle in creative writing as taught academically, there is this idea, I think, that you're joining a long conversation. And we talked in the first part about anxiety of influence and so on. But I think there's part of that conversing with those influences, conversing with writers that have gone before and so on. And I think that's at the root of the creativity, particularly, as Lucy said so clearly, it changes as you get more and more through your personal experience of levels of creative writing. But I think early on, it is very much about listening to other voices and responding to them, not necessarily aping their style or anything, but thinking about how they go about creating something so compelling and responding to it ourselves. One of the exercises that Lucy will have done a few years ago is one of the ones that has sort of stuck with me, is reading Wordsworth's Westminster Bridge and then thinking about, okay, go onto a bridge yourself. What can you see? And how do you reflect on this afterwards? Because it's something that, obviously Wordsworth, the great romantic poet associated with nature, is going into the polluted city that we know perhaps more through William Blake's vision at the time, and seeing something rather magnificent and surprising us to anyone that knows anything about Wordsworth. And so we're getting this thing from a couple of hundred years ago, and it might seem strange to us. We can look at the structure of the poem, but also just this way of looking at the world, which we might not have done when we came in here. And we'll look at all different sorts of poems and different sorts of prose and so on and think about them. And it's opening us up to these conversations. Once you're part of that conversation, which I think academic study in any subject is, whatever it is, it might be physics, it might be biology or whatever, it is entering into a long going on conversation, and you come in and intensely focus on it. But once you've got that going on, I think what the aim, in very simple terms, of a creative writing course of any sort is to help students to become the writer they want to become. And so you start off by giving opportunities to find out what writer they might want to be, because you go into a course and you might think, I've always read young adult fantasy and I want to write young adult fantasy, but you might find something that you didn't even know existed beforehand, which is certainly my experience of higher education. I had certain enthusiasms when I went in, and some of those got developed and I found other ones entirely. But there is that finding out what the possibilities are and then nurturing development as a writer in that way. So it's why the teaching of it is so immensely rewarding, is because everyone wants to be a different writer, and it's about supporting them in that rather than imposing things.
Right. Can I come on to Amina?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting the way this conversation has gone in the direction of conversation. One of my research interests, and part of what I started on my thesis with, is imitation, the idea of imitation, which is how writers are consciously writing back to previous writers. And it was a big thing in the Renaissance, where originality was just meant you were lazy and hadn't read anything. So imitation, Petrarch defines imitation, the result of imitation, as being like the difference between a father and a son, or between the portrait and the sitter. So it should be a completely new, distinct piece of work, but it's immediately recognisable as belonging to the previous, the model, and so on. So that kind of conversation is a really fascinating part of when you're in the classroom and directing people to do some creative writing. One of the things we do is, as I was saying, you read poems or stories, extracts of stories or whatever, and you're thinking about different ways in which other people have approached this same topic and how they've written. I mean, one creative writing exercise I've never done myself is give people a line from a poem, and then they write a new poem from that line. Right. Which, I mean, you can then lose the first line if you want, or you can say, well, this is in tribute to whoever, and so on. So that's quite
the title.
Quite a good one. But one of my favourite exercises is giving people different words or images that are apparently unconnected, and getting them to write something that comes out of that. Because I think if you're in your own mind, you kind of know the grooves you're going to go along. You're conscious of what you want to do. And that can be quite limited. And if you suddenly get several different things together in a way that you wouldn't have done yourself, you then create something new.
Can I ask, what would you say to someone who, perhaps this is to all three of you, to someone who might hear this and think, that sounds great, I love all the ideas, but my experience of creative writing is that it's very private and personal. And so I'm somewhat nervous about the conversation aspect of it. What would you say to that person?
Shall I dive in? Again, going back to something that I said in the first part of this, I was a very nervous of talking to people, much less anything else. I didn't come into being someone who speaks in a public sphere or in any way until I started at university. And it was just because of the excitement I felt in the subjects I was studying, that they overcame my personal reticence. It was the passion I found in committing myself to study which enabled me to speak in public. Certainly when I was a child, it was suggested at school I'd probably go into teaching English or something, but at the same time it was suggested that that wasn't for me because I never spoke to people. Whereas, suddenly I found myself with the ability as well as the passion for the subject, and it was the passion for the subject that gave me the ability to stand in front of a class and talk to a room full of people I don't know, because that's way more important than my reticence is. So that's sort of what I'd say. Just commit yourself to what it is that you want to do.
I mean, I've also been in the position of not wanting to talk to anyone occasionally, but also certainly of not wishing to read my own work out or have anyone read it or respond to it or comment on it. So I completely understand that position. And perhaps this is something that writers are quite like, because a lot of it is a very solitary, private exercise. And if you don't enjoy that, you're not going to do it. So there's something certainly in me that responds to that, being alone and writing stuff. But equally well, there's something enormously exciting about sharing work with other people. And so when we do, for instance, the open mic word space at Leeds Trinity here, we have people coming in and reading out their work. And it's a very stimulating night. And the stimulating thing is not just the bit that you've written and read out, and it's not just listening to the other people as well, but it's a kind of mixture of both. It's you're going out there and you're saying, this is what I wrote, and you're listening to other people. And the crucial thing, I think, there is that everybody in the room is there for that purpose. And in the classroom, ideally, that's how students feel, because we are all doing the same thing in the room. So it isn't exactly the same as talking to friends outside or family outside or strangers in the street, but you're in a room with other people who are doing the same thing. And I think that's a crucial element.
I always say to people when I'm recommending creative writing courses at Leeds Trinity, well, it'll be a friendly audience. It's not like the people you're speaking to are all primed to find fault with what you're doing, like some kind of jury on a TV program. But so it's an ideal opportunity to find your way there. Would you like to add in?
Yeah, I just sort of want to echo what Amina was saying, and also us. I think writers, we can be, very self-conscious people and very private people, which, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you put us in that space where you're with people who want to listen to your work, it takes away that sort of boundary of having to prove yourself to someone who isn't a writer. And I think that's something we'll probably have with us for the rest of our lives. But, whenever someone is keen to listen and who will, attentively watch and, are always keen to get involved as well, and it takes away that pressure and it takes away that sort of self-consciousness that can make us very, shy or whatnot. And it was interesting what you were saying. I was actually about, not wanting or not sort of being able to, publicly speak for a long time, but I've definitely come out of my shell a hell of a lot since, starting at university and being able to have that space to feel that my work is valid and having, the staff and everyone in the English department especially to allow me to have room to speak in whatever capacity that is. It's something that I'm very, very thankful for.
Am I all right to ask a question? So obviously I did linguistics, and I could take options from creative writing, but I chose not to, not because I didn't want to do them, but because I felt like I wasn't creative enough to take a creative writing subject. So what would you say to people who think like that? Because now looking backwards, maybe I could have done it and everyone can be creative, but I'm not really sure if that's true or what your take on it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd say to that is that there is a kind of structure in the way that creative writing is taught. And anybody can take part in writing something. There are exercises, sort of public events where really. So when I was saying, here are 3 words, they're unrelated, make something out of them. That is actually giving you a structure, and it's an open structure because everybody in the room will write something different from the same 3 words, and you're using your own head and your own knowledge and everything like that. So I think that's what would, for me, reassure people who think they're not creative enough. obviously they're creative or they wouldn't be interested in it in the first place. So that's there that kind of the interest is enough. And then you get all this guidance and you can surprise yourself with what you find inside your own head.
Am I right in remembering you were at a collaborative writing thing?
I did an English week last year. But yeah, besides that, I've never taken part in anything like that. Not for a lack of interest, but for a lack of confidence, perhaps.
Well, now you will.
Yes, I definitely. I feel like I have to.
Right, well, shall we turn our attention now then to a particular poem that's come into the public domain for a very specific reason, which is that we've recently had the coronation of King Charles III, and part of all the formalities of that process, of which there are a great number, one that was part of it was the poet laureate writing a poem for the occasion and sharing it with, well, in a sense, with the nation, with everyone who was involved. I don't think the poet laureate is officially actually required to do that. It's just that it is a sort of expectation that goes with the job. And so Simon Armitage's poem is called An Unexpected Guest, featuring Samuel Pepys. And it's that subtitle, featuring Samuel Pepys, is because the third of the 4 sections of the poem is a little series of extracts from Samuel Pepys's diary of the day he went to the coronation of King Charles II, which I suppose was in 1660 or 1661. So Simon Armitage has sort of gathered some details from that and put that into the poem, but he's had to kind of explain that obviously in the title. So I thought it would be interesting for us to read that and then just talk about it briefly as an example of a creative piece of creative writing that has been produced under very kind of unusual circumstances, but what's I think is in a sense also valuable about that, and I suppose this is what Simon Armitage thinks is valuable about being poet laureate, the fact that you have poet laureate and they produce a poem and everybody is willing to accept it is a sign of the kind of place of creative writing in society. We might think in lots of contexts it's not very highly valued, but it does have this kind of formal recognition in this exercise, and so it's a kind of interesting occasion to think about creative writing in society, I suppose. So we're going to read this. It's in 4 parts, and so everybody is going to take one part. So the reader's going to start.
She's treated herself to new shoes, a window seat on the fast train, a hotel for the night. She's been to the capital twice before, once to see Tutankhamun when she was 9, and once when it rained. Crossing the mall, she's just a person like everyone else, but her hand keeps checking the invitation, her thumb strumming the gilded edge of the card, her finger tracing the thread of embossed leaves. In sight of the great porch, she can't believe the police just step aside, the doors shaped for gods and giants should open to let her in.
She's taken her place with ambulance drivers and nurses and carers and charity workers, a man who alchemised hand sanitizer from gin, a woman who walked for sponsored miles, the boy in the tent. The heads of state float down the aisle. She knows the names of 7 or 8. But the music's the thing, a quiet transmuting psalms into sonorous light, the cavernous sleepwalking dreams of the organ making the air vibrate, chords coming up through the soles of her feet. Somewhere further along and deeper in there are golden and sacred things going on, glimpses of crimson, flashes of jewels like flames, high priests in their best bling, the solemn wording of incantations and spells, till the part where promise and prayer become fused, the moment is struck, a pact is sworn.
And got to the abbey, raised in the middle, bishops in cloth of gold copes, nobility all in their parliament robes. The crown being put on his head, a great shout begun, and he came forth, taking the oath, and bishops kneeled and proclaimed, if any could show any reason why should not be the king, that now he should come and speak. The ground covered with blue cloth, and the king came in with his crown, and Mon and his sceptre in hand.
She'll watch it again on the 10 o'clock news, from the armchair throne in her living room. Did the cameras notice her coral pink hat, or her best coat pinned with the hero's medal she got for being herself? The invitation is propped on the mantelpiece by the carriage clock. She adorned the day with ordinariness. She is blessed to have brought the extraordinary home, and now she'll remember the house sparrow she thought she'd seen in the abbey roof, arcing from eave to eave, beyond and above.
Right. I thought we would just all contribute an observation on this poem according to what we think. I'll just start. I first became aware of this poem when I went to a little tea party on the weekend of the coronation, taking an elderly relative to it. So it was quite a traditional event with, a little quiz about the monarchy, and then we had some community singing of songs, not hymns actually. They were like pop songs that we all sang. So. But there was a little interval, and at that point, the person who was like the compere said, "Oh, well, while we're waiting for this, I will just read the poem that the poet laureate has written for the occasion." So he did. So he read it. But I think in that context, everyone was slightly kind of unable to take it in. I mean, you can imagine that in a way is what a poem for an occasion is for, but it wasn't quite the right context. This poem actually takes a bit more reading, I think, in that context. Since then, I've read it myself to groups of people several times to see what their reaction was. But the question I want to introduce first before asking anyone else is, how old do you imagine this lady to be, who is the main person who we imagine going to the coronation as one of those guests who represent, as he uses the word at the end. And it comes back to Amina's book title, The Ordinariness of Parrots. And she's also kind of imagined at the end as, or mentioned at the end as ordinary. But how old do you imagine she is?
Mid to late 60s.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd say 60s, because she's clearly been working fairly recently.
Oh, that's a good point, isn't it? Yes.
And she went to see Tutankhamun when she was 9, which I remember vaguely. I was probably a bit younger, so she's probably a couple of years younger than me.
This is my kind of because I found myself thinking of her as quite a bit older than that, actually. I don't know, it was the reference to perhaps it's just the coronation starts you thinking about the 1950s and so on. So I pictured her as someone kind of older, and I think it's also that thing about not having been to London except twice. But as you say, it's a very specific reference, isn't it? Tells us the Tutankhamun exhibition.
Was Simon Armitage about 9 when Tutankhamun?
I've done my research. The Tutankhamun exhibition was in 1972. And she was 9 then, which means that she was born in 1963, which is when Simon Armitage was also born. So she is the exact same age as Simon Armitage. And that threw me because that kind of means that, in a way, you don't have to think of her in this kind of rather sort of old-fashioned frame. I'm thinking, she went to London for the Tutankhamun exhibition. She might have gone to go to a Bon Jovi concert or to see Les Miserables or something like that. It's kind of more contemporary. And this coral pink hat.
Yeah.
My first image of that was like something that people used to kind of wear perhaps in church in the 1950s or something at the first coronation. It could just as well be some kind of an elegant fascinator, I found it's a poem that initially makes you think one kind of thing, and then it actually is. It's slightly challenging your ideas of how you think of ordinariness in this context. That's my beginning with it. Who would like to go next?
Well, I think once I thought about this, and I thought, it does sound like you imagine from only having been to London twice, perhaps someone very old or something. But I do remember living in Cheshire, and our next door neighbours, they'd only been once and thought they might go again one day. And you might think, it's very parochial or something, but it's also, London had nothing to do with their lives. And I think we do tend to get this media centricity of, and this is where everything's happening. And actually, for a lot of people in Britain, it isn't that important. And why would you go there?
Yeah.
So I think there's something a little bit, political, and obviously you think of Simon Armitage, a bit northern, and he's very much about bringing culture to the north, and it's like, actually, why have we needed to go here?
Yes.
So I think there's something nicely political in there. Certainly the way I read it.
Yes. So that makes that makes another way of thinking about this information that you've only been twice. And another observation, Lucy?
Yeah, pretty much the same as Oz. When I read this for the first time, I thought I enjoyed the ordinariness of this, but also, there's nothing ordinary about going to see Tutankhamun when you're 9 years old. It's the excitement, and it's, the breaking away from your daily life up north, perhaps. And I really enjoyed that.
Yes, because that comes out again when the way that the actual ceremony is described as well. So it's like, that's a really interesting thought, that the ceremony is like the Tutankhamun exhibition. So when she's got home and she's brought the extraordinary home, she did that before when she was 9. Yeah, I think that's interesting. He says the capital. He doesn't say London. He says the capital. So it's absolutely playing the role of being the capital city. It's not London. It could be any capital.
That's true.
And that's the significance of this city, that it is the capital, because the whole thing is about ceremony. The significance of Charles is that he is the king, and so on, or the archbishop is the archbishop. And so it's this kind of ceremonial roles that everything, even the place, is playing in this.
Yvonne, did you want to?
I've heard this in the English week, and I've heard it now. I don't really like it, and I don't really know what else to say. I feel like it doesn't really speak to me.
And I think it's very well done, and I thought this about his Prince Philip poem as well, in that it caters for all audiences. So it is kind of saying something for the royalists. It's also saying something for the anti-royalists, because it's not focusing on Charles. There's practically nothing about Charles in here. It's not eulogising the royal family, but it is recognising spectacle, the attraction of spectacle, and the way you would feel, whatever your politics was, when you were going up to these enormous doors and they opened for you and you're going into this extraordinary ceremony. And so it sort of gets away from taking any particular side, and it becomes very much about a human being experiencing things that are, exciting and awe-inspiring, the flashes of jewels and the sonorous echoes.
I also wonder if I don't sort of get that feeling, because I'm relatively new to the UK, and all of these sort of is a bit lost on me, like the greatness of ceremonies, or like things that are done at a national level is sort of lost on me. It's not really the same where I come from. There's not really that much weight put into things like that, so it's sort of a little bit lost on me, I think.
Yeah.
Why? I'm not keen on the final section, which I think is perhaps most of, anyway, I find a little bit too, this is telling me what to think now, particularly after that wonderful use of fragment. And I do like fragments and so on. However, there's, one of the things, and I do like a lot of Simon Armitage's work, and one of the things that he's become sort of known for in recent years are his translations of medieval poetry. And I think, my absolute favourite poem in the English language is Gawain and the Green Knight, and most translations are pretty awful, whereas his is wonderful because it's got the texture of language. I think he's a wonderful translator of medieval verse. And of course, you read that last thing and you see the sparrow up in the roof.
Yes.
And you think of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle,
yes,
and the transitoriness of human life and so on. And there's something really, really neat there. And of course,
yes,
the more I think about it, the doors are for gods and giants, and you think of the works of giants in the Anglo-Saxon elegies and so on. But, and if I can lower the tone here, as soon as I read the excerpt that we end with from Pepys, and the last thing is, and his sceptre in his hand, and as soon as I read that, I thought of Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls, where we've got the god Priapus with his sceptre in his hand, and it's a medieval, as we say in literary terms, nod gag. And I just, what is he saying about Charles here? And I don't want to ruin his job for him, but I saw that medieval reference there because I'm tuned into this. And is there something a bit?
There's something a bit too phallic there.
There's something very phallic in Chaucer, and so knowing Simon Armitage's depth of knowledge on medieval literature, surely he would have spotted that. That can't be accidental.
Well, I was interested in the word before that, monde. which, in fact, when I read it at the English Week, I left out the peeps bit because I just didn't feel I didn't know what that word monde meant.
Isn't it the orb?
It is the orb. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it is the orb. Now,
Yeah.
bit of a shocker here. This word is not actually in the Oxford English Dictionary meaning orb. It's just there as monde, the name of the 19th or 20th century industrialist, and his name kind of circulates as a kind of reference point. But I couldn't find monde meaning orb.
It means world, though, doesn't it?
Yes.
As in the French,
Yes.
the beau
Yes.
monde and so on.
Yes.
So I assume that the globe, the orb, is the world that the king is holding.
That seems to be it. And
Yes.
if you look up the Chaucer, the Pepys, I know I keep on saying Chaucer, Pepys passage where it's been annotated, someone's annotated it and said, oh, that must mean it's like you say, the orb, and which goes with the sceptre. But it just, I'm not sure. That suggests that word's only been used once before, but now Simon Armitage has used it again. And I got lots of people like us kind of slightly puzzling over it.
Well, it can make you think of empire because the empire was the one on which the sun never set. And the ambition was for it to be a world empire like the Roman one. So here he is holding his the world in his hand. A little bit ironic, perhaps now, but
That's why it's
yes,
it's
chopped
Pepys
off.
is quoting. Yeah.
Yes, and it's also it's kind of chopped off. So yeah,
I think there's quite a lot of sort of layers in this, aren't there, or potential layers to discover, which, again, when we think about Simon Armitage as poet laureate, and this comes back to what you were saying, Amina, he wants to fulfill the function of the poet in this context, but it's just like with the anxiety of influence, it must be this huge anxiety of audience.
Yes, anxiety of audience.
And I think so in that sense, by writing something that is got so many different sort of things you can draw, that's quite an achievement, isn't it?
I think and this is going back to something Oz was saying about the final stanza telling you what to think. And I think that there is something about public poetry, public occasional poetry. And the same thing happened with that poem from America, whose name I can't remember, the girl. At Biden's.
At Biden's
the poet who read at Biden's inauguration. Again, there were very obvious points being made, but they have to be made in public poetry because they might go out once, or even if people listen to them again, they might not be doing the sort of things that we're doing, like thinking about French meanings of words or Chaucerian contexts or anything like that. So you do have to be fairly clear, especially when it's a public occasion. So to say she brought the ordinary home, or the hero's medal she got for being herself, he is kind of saying, this is the point. It's what I'm saying here in this poem. And it's immediately, it kind of pulls everybody together, right? Yes, I know what you're talking about. And I think public poetry is almost a genre in itself because it has to do that. It's like public art as well.
I think a lot of public poems that poet laureates have written in the past, probably the further back you go, they are fairly kind of disposable. And they're for the day of the event, and then no one's particularly bothered. I feel this one, it could take its place more as a poem you might go back to.
I think so, because of those the very clear influences that he has brought in. I think there's still things to say about it rather than hooray for the king.
That's something I enjoyed a lot about this, and in my opinion, I didn't think it was a criticism nor a celebration. Really, I think you could pick out so many different, not emotions, but symbolisms, I suppose, in this, and it's something that, if you hear it read out twice, 4 times, 25 times, I think you pick something new out of it, or you can interpret it a different way. And just hearing what Oz was saying about it, and Amina, and everybody else, it's really fascinating. And I think maybe that was his intention.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That poem is An Unexpected Guest by Simon Armitage. You can download this from the website of the royal family, or from lots of other places as well. So that, I think, is a good point to end. I'd like to thank my invited guests, not unexpected guests. Thank you very much indeed, Oz, Lucy and Amina and Yvonne, for your contributions to this give me a C episode. I'll have to go back later and make a long list of all the things beginning with C that have come up, as we've done quite a few. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I've got to at least 10 with my list of important things we mentioned, beginning with C. So we had C for creative writing, C for Chaucer, C for Commedia, which is the title of the Italian poet Dante's great work, C for Oz's book, A Census of Preconceptions, and C for Anne Caldwell, who has co-edited the Valley Press anthology of prose poetry with Oz. C for the writer and performer Robert Calvert, C for Connected, C for Coronation, and Capital and Charles. Now, we recorded our 2 creative writing episodes not long after the coronation of King Charles III, and unfortunately it has taken a while for us to catch up with editing and finishing it. And now we're finally at that stage. I've discovered that I have got to add 2 more very important words beginning with C, which are check and correct. In our conversation about the word monde, meaning orb, which is used by Pepys in his diary entry for the coronation of Charles II, and then it was used by Simon Armitage in his poem for the coronation of Charles III, I said there was no entry for the word monde in the Oxford English Dictionary. Now I've checked this again, and I can see that what I said wasn't entirely wrong, but it also wasn't the whole story, so I need to correct what I said. It is true there's no entry in the OED for monde, in the sense that Pepys used it. It's not a head word as such, but it is included as a variant form in another entry for the word mound, meaning the world or a globe or an orb representing the globe. And that, incidentally, is a completely different word from mound in the sense of a pile of earth. Now, this word mound or monde has a history going back to the 1300s, and during the period 1500 to 1700, which includes when Pepys was writing, it sometimes appeared as monde. Now it's hardly used at all in any form, and so instead we say orb or globe, and I think that's why the appearance of the word monde was puzzling me. Anyway, so there we are, 2 principles that are very important to us at English at Leeds Trinity. Always check your references, and never underestimate how much the OED knows about the history of English.
You can find out more about English at Leeds Trinity from the Leeds Trinity University website, www.leedstrinity.ac.uk, and also from our at Leeds Trinity channel on YouTube, and from our Twitter account at LTU English. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Steve Oxen and ThessalianStudios.com for this music, which is called Rio After Dark.